Welcome everyone to this ELPC Thinks webinar. I'm Howard Lerner. I'm ELPC's Executive Director, and this is a series where we bring together experts, authors, environmental leaders, and community partners to deal with the important issues of today, and particularly strategies for action and for progress. Quick heads up, we're recording this webinar and posting it to YouTube, streaming it live on Facebook so that not only can you join, but the many people who've wanted to join this who perhaps can't will have an opportunity to see the recorded version. And today we're talking with Dick Munson, who wrote the book Power Corrupts, Cleaning Up America's Biggest Industry. That industry is the utility industry, and we're talking about utility political corruption. Dick is a longtime environmental leader and advocate. He's a prolific author. He's worked on clean energy and environmental issues for not-for-profits, for for-profit companies in the private sector, at universities and on Capitol Hill. He was most recently Senior Director of the Environmental Defense Fund, where he advanced clean energy and smart power in the Midwest. We have a lot to dive into today. As many of you may know, on the one hand, Ohio former House Speaker Larry Householder, Republican. He's been convicted of corruption involving First Energy, a utility in Ohio, and convicted in the trial court. A jury found him guilty, appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, and just this week, the Sixth Circuit, within the last week, denied his petition for a rehearing in bank. So the conviction stands, and the only recourse is for him to try to take this up to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Illinois, the Commonwealth Edison four of whom have been convicted in the district court of issues involving utility corruption with politics and the utility. The sentencing has been done for three of the members of the ComEd 4, 18 to 24-month sentences, and the fourth will be sentenced next week. As I've always said, if we want clean energy, we need clean government. So Dick Munson, you're a student of this. You've been following what's gone on in Ohio, I know, for at least almost a decade. Why don't you talk a little bit about the Ohio story? Why do we care about? Why are you writing a book on corruption in the energy sector? What's at stake for us all?
Well, corruption, I do have to admit, is not the most uplifting of subjects. But I would argue, and I try to argue in the book, that it is one of the most important. I mean, because I don't mean to get into too much alliteration, but corruption is corrupting. It, corrodes the public trust in our basic institutions, business and government. And unfortunately, it's growing. Both nationally, where almost every day you turn on the news and there's some announcement of some gift that is being presented to obtain access, or there's new pay-to-play schemes. And as you noted, it's also rising in the utility industry. It's not, as you also noted, it's sort of a bipartisan attribute of being corrupt, but it's not limited to the Midwest. I mean, I think my experience here was what prompted me to begin looking at corruption as an issue for utilities, targeting one particular industry. But it's a national evolution that is unfortunately growing, that I think we all need to take advantage of the opportunities that it presents, but also figure out ways to block it, because it is standing in the way of climate change and clean energy development.
You know, Dick, in your book, you implicitly make the case that utility corruption is different and in some ways more dangerous or pernicious than other forms of corporate misconduct. Talk a little bit about that one, would you?
Well, utilities have this odd relationship. They're odd corporations. They're, in some regard, they're adhered to the interests of their shareholders, but they're also supposedly public institutions that are regulated monopolies. They have no competition. They're guaranteed profits. And on top of that, because I think the political mindset or the business mindset of monopolists is not to be adventurous or be all that held accountable for realizing economic trends, they've gotten themselves in trouble. And when they're in trouble, they seek subsidies and bailouts. And unfortunately, recently, as they seek those bailouts and subsidies, they've gone to fraud and racketeering.
One of the things I've always thought about the utility context, when you're dealing with failed coal plants or old nuclear plants that aren't operating very well, or that the utilities just want to keep charging ratepayers money, this is billions of dollars at
Mm,
stake. You're talking about raising rates to consumers at a level that is not tens of millions, it's hundreds of millions and
yep.
billions of dollars. So, for example, in Ohio, where First Energy um, gave about $60 million of bribes. I mean, you and I would talk $60 million. That's a staggering figure. On the other hand, if you have a couple $1 billion at stake, $60 million is a relatively, small amount. It's 6% of $1 billion. Would you invest 6% to try to get the whole enchilada? So talk a little bit about the House Bill 6 scandal in Ohio. Biggest scandal in Ohio's history. The utility First Energy and its various entities used about $60 million in bribes to secure the bailout of failing coal and nuclear plants. What do these cases tell you about how utilities operate and how the politicians interact with the utilities?
Well, we have to recognize First Energy was a long time in coming towards its corruption. It spent a fair amount of time realizing, with its new CEO, Chuck Jones, at the time, that he made some really bad business calls. I think in part because he had grown up in the utility and had a monopoly mindset of thinking he didn't have these competitive forces who were forcing him to have consequences if he made bad decisions. So he even tripled down on coal at the very time that clean air regulations became more strict and fracking became more prominent. So natural gas was cheaper and easier and more abundant to have, and he was stuck with all these coal plants. He did a similar thing with nuclear power, not realizing that after 3 Mile Island, there might be a few more regulations to make sure these things are safe. And so instead of doing what most businesses in competitive industries would do of cut shareholder expenses or dividends or cut executive pay in the multi-millions of dollars, he became basically a lobbying firm that happened to generate a little bit of electricity, and he sought subsidies here and there. Both particularly he started in Ohio, but in the early stages, actually conservative Ohio legislators at that point were pro-competition, free market conservatives who thought that, giving subsidies to a monopoly was a crazy, socialistic idea. So he went to Washington, tried there, and then he came back and cut basically a deal, as you noted, with the soon-to-be speaker, Larry Householder. And the sums are indeed massive, as you suggested, about 60 some odd million dollars that ended up for a $1.3 billion bailout package for his failed reactors and coal fire plants. So from his perspective, it became, his own, he thought, I think, his only option since he had failed in all of his other subsidy appeals. And so let's try political bribery and fraud. And, for a time, it seemed to have worked. I mean, the House Bill 6 did indeed pass. His bribe to obtain a chairman of the Public Utility Commission of Ohio, of someone who would be sympathetic to his interests, also, was achieved. It's, I think, just the dogged work of some reporters and journalists and prosecutors and environmental and consumer groups that shined a light on his trickery and resulted in, as you noted, the 20-year prison term for the speaker, Larry Householder. And to avoid jail, there were two indicted individuals who both committed suicide. Two others pled guilty. The utility faced about a $500 million worth of fines. So it caught up to him, but boy, it wasn't easy.
So, Dick, we've been talking about this so far in the legislative political context. Something you mentioned, though, was um, the chair of the Public Utility Commission, a gentleman, Sam Randazzo, who had a consulting contract with the utility that got sort of a big payout shortly before he became chair of the commission. Um, some of this I in an organizational sense, take personally. Uh, the Environmental Law and Policy Center, mostly through our really good senior attorney, Rob Kelter, Eric O'Donnell, who's now in Columbus, intervene and participate in cases before the Public Utility Commission. And, you know, you'd like to think we can get a fair shake. And certain commissions are a little more pro-consumer, some not, some more pro-utility, some more pro-environment, some not. But that's a different story where people are bringing a little bit of their views to the table. Then they flat out are being bribed. Talk a little bit about Randazzo and how that played out before the Public Utility Commission.
Well, for a long period of time, he had organized a group of large industrial electricity consumers in Ohio. And secretly, he was obtaining payments from First Energy. And actually, when he cut deals between those industrialists and First Energy, he took a take of it. And that happened for a long period of time that nobody was sort of aware of. There were rumors about his houses that he had bought in Florida and in Columbus. And Governor DeWine had been warned, or at least his staff had been warned about Mr. Randazzo's proclivities. But, you know, a couple of days after the election, when Chuck Jones and his chief lobbyist met with the newly elected governor and lieutenant governor, right after that meeting, they went over to Randazzo's house in German Village and cut a deal for another $4.3 million of a payment to Randazzo with the hope that he would become chairman, and with the hope, which became quite real, that when chairman, he would advance a variety of very utility measures that embellish the First Energy quite substantially.
Just think about it, folks, in these terms. You're a public interest attorney. You're litigating a case involving First Energy before the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio. And you're putting on expert witnesses. You're cross-examining the First Energy's expert witnesses. You're writing briefs. You're doing oral argument before the commission. You're doing a good job. You're representing consumers, environmental interests, other public interests. Except nobody told you that the chair of the commission who's making the decision just received $4.3 million from the utility whose case it is. I mean, that's the situation we have in Ohio. And I think, Dick, I'm summing that up pretty fairly.
I think that's fair. Scary, but fair.
All right. Any other lessons from Ohio before we turn to Illinois and then look more to a national picture?
Well, I think the lesson is that there were not breaks that were involved in the whole system. Take Sam Randazzo, for instance. I mean, he was appointed by the governor, but recommended by a slate of individuals who recommend PUCO, commissioners. It so happens that happened to be chaired, I think, by a former First Energy lobbyist. There were coal representatives. Sam Randazzo himself had been on this, nominating committee for years. And so there was no check, if you will, that there's these checks and balances that you would hope would alert the governor, and the governor would be honest enough to recognize they don't really want to have a top regulator who happened to just get a $4.3 million bribe and previously had gotten something over 20 million some odd dollars in payments from First Energy to cut these sweetheart deals with industrialists, and as well as he also worked for a variety of groups that opposed, wind farms and solar collectors. So he was a piece of work, and there were just not the institutions that were around to be able to ensure through transparency where he was getting his money, who was supporting him, and would you really want to have him as your top regulator, a person who had been employed by First Energy for so many years.
Dick, there's a question from Gary Profit in the Q&A box saying, I'm sure there are lots of bribes and payoffs for wind and solar power. And actually, Gary, I'm not sure that's correct. Sam Randazzo was investigated very extensively. The Larry Householder matter was in a federal court proceeding. You had investigations being done by the Ohio Attorney General and by the U.S. Attorney's Office. And at least in terms of the public airing of that, you would think that if there were some bribes being paid, like First Energy was paying to Randazzo, or the $60 million from First Energy to Householder, that would have come up in the court proceedings, either brought by the Ohio Attorney General or by the U.S. Attorney. And Dick, maybe you're aware of something, but I didn't hear of anything like that surfacing at all. This was First Energy with coal and nuclear.
I just want to make it clear, fighting corruption, I think, is not a partisan issue. As you noted, we have a Speaker of the House in Illinois who's a Democrat, a Speaker of the House in Ohio who's a Republican. Both of them are facing jail. One's in jail and one's facing a jail term. But it also should not be technology focused. I mean, if in fact there are wind farms or developers that are bribing their way to get, contracts, go after them. We need rules and regulations that ensure that we have a fair playing field out there for all technologies. I'm not aware of them. That's not saying that they're not there, but I'm also not saying I'm just targeting, provisions for, clamping down only on utilities and coal and nuclear plants. This should
And,
be non-technology, non-partisan.
and Dick, on your nonpartisan point, in Ohio, the politicians involved were mostly or entirely Republicans who dominate the Ohio legislature. So let's shift to Illinois, where the legislature has been dominated by Democrats, and it involved Commonwealth Edison, the large electric utility here. You want to talk about that one a little bit?
Well, sure. The amounts were not quite as large, and the tactics were probably not quite as sorted, but they were still corrupt, at least by the opinion of various juries. We had the ComEd 4, as you noted, the former CEO and three of her top lieutenants, who provided about $1.3 million to allies of the Speaker, Mike Madigan, in exchange for him advancing legislation that would provide about $150 million worth of benefits to Commonwealth Edison. It was from you look at it from that perspective, $1.3 million for a $150 million return, it's pretty good. And they tried to argue in court that what they were doing was essentially just regular lobbying, but the jury came back and said, lobbying is appropriate. We need good lobbyists to provide information and guidance to lawmakers, and they will make their independent decisions. But this was beyond it. This was indeed a pay-to-play scheme that was a conspiracy and an enterprise that was breaking the law. And as you noted, the speaker is former speaker Mike Madigan has now been recently sentenced to 7.5 years. And as you also noted, some three of the four have ComEd 4 have been sentenced to terms of 18 to 24 months. So the consequences in Illinois are not quite as large as they were in Ohio, but there was still corruption. And at the end of the day, that corruption is having consequences.
Dick, you wrote a book that you certainly talk about the Ohio and Illinois situations, and the Environmental Law and Policy Center works in the Midwest. We don't work in the Southeast or the Northwest. Explain a little bit how this is a national problem. It's
Well,
just not a matter of Ohio or Illinois or some things that have been raised in Wisconsin. How does this fit more broadly?
Well, this is what surprised me, I must admit. I mean, because I, like you, have been focused when I was at the Environmental Defense Fund on Ohio and Illinois. But as you begin to investigate, you realize in Arizona, for instance, the utility funded a dark money group that financed the campaigns of regulators who would be sympathetic to them. They even spent $1.7 million to oppose a commissioner's reelection because she had been asking for more financial oversight. In Florida, the utility commission chairman, he bribed a ghost candidate, somebody who had the same last name as the Democratic legislator who was raising questions about the utility's finances. And that person ended up admitting to being bribed and, had a term. The CEO told his staff that he wanted to make that legislator's life a living hell. In South Carolina, the CEO of the utility there was sentenced to 2 years in prison for defrauding investors and consumers about the cost of nuclear reactors. The list, unfortunately, goes on. And I think, to go to one of your original points is there's really no need for this. The utilities have a business structure whereby they are guaranteed, revenue relative to their investments. But I think because of some bad business decisions and an outmoded business model, they're finding themselves seeking subsidies and bailouts. And in the process of doing that, they unfortunately have turned to fraud and racketeering.
Dick, you do a quick survey, of the other Midwest states, just because most of the people on this webinar are from the Midwest. Talk a little bit, if you want, about Indiana, Michigan, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin.
I wish I
Anything you want
could. Howard, you probably could do this better than I can because
All
I
right.
really focused on those that I did have. But, it does raise a point, as I was investigating, it's a lot of work um,
Yeah.
to identify, problems such as these. So commendations to the reporters and the prosecutors and the environmental and consumer groups. But my goodness, it's hard to track. And this I'm sure there are states where none of this goes on and there's perfectly fine, regulated monopoly business practices. I just seem to run across and therefore have concluded that it appears that corruption is growing in the utility sector, and that's scary.
Yeah. Dick, there's a question asked by Chuck and Andurus about the impact of Supreme Court decisions such as Citizens United. Suffice it to say, there are some black areas and white areas of the law, and there are a lot of gray areas. We're dealing with what is claimed to be uh, sometimes permissible political speech, the question of what is fair lobbying and what's a quid pro quo. And the answer on that, without getting into my environmental constitutional law class at University of
Oh,
Chicago,
go ahead.
yeah, is that this is complicated, and I can't do a legal summary here. I think what we're going to see is uh, Mr. Householder raised before the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit an allegation that what he did was protected by the First Amendment. In effect, he said, even if it's bribery, it's protected by the First Amendment. Two of the three-judge panel rejected that. The third judge on the three-judge panel said maybe there's a little something there, but the court denied hearing it en banc. So this is either the end of the case in Ohio, or Mr. Householder will seek to bring this up to the U.S. Supreme Court, file a petition for a writ of certiorari, which um, the court could grant, but they only grant about 80 cases a year. In Illinois, following the convictions and now sentencing of 3 of the ComEd 4, there'll be another sentencing over the next week or so. We'll see whether they bring the case to an end or whether any of the ComEd 4 make an appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and they likewise argue that they are engaged in protected activities. And we'll see what the Seventh Circuit does on it. So certainly all of these people who've been convicted are aggressively raising issues of the First Amendment and Citizens United in different ways before the courts. We'll see if the courts really do give any more salience to that, to be determined.
Can I interject? Because I'm not
Please.
a lawyer or certainly a constitutional expert. I would be harsher on the Supreme Court, which I would think over the last couple of decades has systematically made it harder to prosecute corruption, and at the same time have opened up the floodgates, if you will, for undisclosed and unlimited campaign financing. Even most recently, note the issue that they have turned this largely into an issue of First Amendment rights of free speech. The corporations in fact, were being restricted from their free speech by having campaign limits on what they could do. But the court, even last year, I think, or the year before, when the Snyder case, as you well know,
Right.
redefined, what was corruption by suggesting that the former mayor of Portage, Indiana, who had been convicted of taking what they initially said was a bribe of $13,000 from a trucking company after that firm received what a $1.1 million city contract. But because of the timing, because the payment came after the contract was signed, the court ruled that this was not a bribe. This was actually a gratuity, a tip, if you will. And so this issue of what is corruption, the court has, I think, quite dramatically narrowed the definition, as you suggested, to quid pro quo, or the actual achievement of a particular legislative action or policy action as a result of, some payment or action by, an interested party. So in part, I mean, I think we're in a place where, at a minimum, we need to be thinking about more transparency, because the Supreme Court has blocked that. Justice Kennedy, who wrote the 5-4 2010 Citizens United decision, certainly, as you note, used the First Amendment as a means by which to expand, political contributions. But even he suggested that the contributions should be disclosed so that people would have the ability to decide who's supporting which particular candidate. And even he admitted that disclosure wasn't working. And so we need to figure out some way to shine a light. The Supreme Court in its current makeup clearly is not going to change its First Amendment approach and its pro-corporation approach. But even, Justice Scalia at the time suggested that there should be a different regimen when it comes to regulated monopolies, which are state-sanctioned monopolies, and suggested that there's an opportunity to think of them separately as needing more regulation on the political contribution side. So I think the door isn't wide open, because the court has been—
There's a crack in the door.
There's a few cracks that possibly creative lawyers can think about utilizing in perhaps future cases that would advance where former Justice Scalia, if you will, the intellectual leader of the court's right wing, was headed, which I would think would be a positive move towards ensuring more transparency in the electric utility industry. And I think as a result would lead to more advancement of alternatives, innovation, and combating climate problems.
Yes, I like to think that at the Environmental Law and Policy Center, we have creative and effective lawyers. That's something we do well. But take that a little bit further, Dick, in terms of actions, solutions, transparency. You've explained in your book, you've explained today, the extent of the problem and how troubling it is and how corrosive it is in terms of, if we don't have cleaner government, clean energy suffers and consumers suffer. So what are the sort of action steps and solutions that groups like ELPC, but our many, many colleague groups working on consumer and clean energy and other issues around the Midwest and nationally, what should we be doing? What should we be asking legislators and public utility commissions and courts to do?
Well, I think, to be honest, a lot of groups are doing a lot of great things, already. So this is not a knock on current actions, but I think that there's an opportunity to use the clean government approach as an effective tool for consumer and environmental groups to advance clean energy innovation. And largely I say that because I go back to some of the polling that's been done that suggests the American public really hates the idea of rich entities being able to scam the system in a way that leads to their benefit, and also scam the system in a way that has them avoid responsibility. That's not a partisan issue. Both the left and the right find that just to be abhorrent. So transparency is certainly one issue when it comes to political contributions. In Arizona, for instance, there was a ballot measure that got approved by 70% of the voters there that suggested that they needed to disclose all the big money payments to dark money political groups trying to influence state and local campaigns. Other things that, pop into my mind, I mean, I think your colleague, Mr. Kelter, and others have been trying to advance more rigor in the selection of regulators, many of whom I would argue have simply become utility lapdogs rather than guard dogs. of the system. And so both elected and appointed candidates should reveal their contributions from everybody, but particularly from utilities. And an argument I think can be made that utility executives and lobbyists, former ones, should not become utility overseers. I mean, it's just they have a conflict. And we don't need conflict of interest when it comes to regulating one of the largest businesses in the country. If I could, can I try two more? Just
Absolutely. Go for it. You get Dick, you get three.
that's too much. Well, I'd also, I think enhancing competition or competitive markets, use it as a check, if you will, on subsidies and bailouts. And I'd argue power corporations should not be allowed to sort of swallow up what are now competitive businesses, such as electric utility charging stations, power transmission lines, even possibly what's happening with data centers. I would argue that to enhance efficiency and modernization, monopoly should be shrunk rather than expanded. Um, and then finally, force utility investors rather than the ratepayers to cover all the costs of all the lobbying that's done by a utility, which should include everything from campaign contributions, lobbying fees, dues to industry advocacy groups, advertisements for image improvement. Legislation to target has been recently approved in Colorado, Connecticut, and Maine.
Wow.
And the argument is pretty simple. The argument's simple. Should we allow powerful utilities to block an individual's freedom and force consumers to cover political persuasion campaigns that they disagree with? So there's a lot of opportunities, I think, to bring ethics and transparency to this industry. And a lot's going on. I'm just trying to argue that here's another tool that should be in all of our tool chest that can make the connection between, as you noted, between clean energy and clean government.
Dick, that's a really good roadmap on what we and others can and should be doing. Last word, I always appreciate, I mean, I have to write legal briefs that sometimes, are 60, 80 pages. They're certainly not brief. Occasionally, not very often, they hit 100 pages, but that's a lot shorter than writing a whole book. You've written books on a lot of things, and that requires a certain amazing discipline and the digging into the research and so forth. What's your next book? And tell me just a little bit about how you think about this is something that I, Dick Munson, really want to spend 2 years of my life digging into and writing a
Or
book
more.
on, or more. Okay. I don't mean to give you short shrift.
Oh no, oh no. I was at a lecture by Eric Larson, who wrote
Sure.
the great book on the Chicago World's Fair.
Yeah,
And
Devil in a White City.
yeah, he was asked what one question he hated getting from anybody, which was what his next book would be, because he said that whenever he started to describe what he was thinking of for the next book, his relatives or best friends would say, "Oh no, that's a stupid idea." So he said, "I just gave up on that book idea." I think so. I'm not sure. I'll leave it at that as far as a future book, but I guess I've been long fascinated with just innovation and just the power of competitive markets and entrepreneurs to develop new technologies that advance us. So I did a biography of Jacques Cousteau, who did the aqua lung and undersea photography. Nikola Tesla, who gave us the electric motor, robots, remote control. Benjamin Franklin, who did everything seemingly. So that's kind of the theme that sort of runs through it. And at the moment, I mean, we are living in a remarkable age when it comes to technology innovation. And I guess one of the challenges is to ensure that that innovation, which includes really advanced sensors, phenomenal computing capacity, batteries, a whole variety of basic things that are not relegated to the electric utility industry, but can be adapted to make real advances within this field that is so important to the nation and to us. So I'm intrigued by how we put together systems that encourage that innovation. And I would argue that corruption and the search for subsidies and bailouts tries to oppose that move towards innovation. And that, I would argue, is something we all should fight against as we seek innovation and modernization.
Dick, thank you for all that you've done on the advocacy, analysis, and action side. And I find your book to be absolutely timely and fascinating. So if anybody wants to get a copy of the book and read the whole thing, Power Corrupts, Cleaning Up America's Biggest Industry. I'm sure if you go on to the web and you look up Dick Munson, you can find an opportunity to buy that book if online, if not in your bookstore. So thank you, Dick, for joining us today. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. This will be posted online. If you have friends who are interested in hearing what Dick and I had to say today, you can direct them to that. ELPC will continue to advocate strongly across the Midwest and nationally. Clean energy requires clean government as we fight for climate solutions. Thank you, Dick Munson, and thank you all for joining us today. All right, take care.
Thanks.